At just 13, Ben was sent to one of the toughest boarding schools in the country. His father said it would make him a man. But behind the cold dorm walls of St. August, strength had a different meaning. It meant silence, it meant obedience, and sometimes it meant surviving nights no one ever spoke about. No one told Ben that silence could be deadly, and speaking up might be even worse. This is the story of a boy, a dorm, and the courage to be heard. Ben clutched his metal box tightly as he followed his father past the school gate. Around him, parents and their sons walked in all directions, some hugging, some laughing, others carrying jerry cans and blankets. St. August High School for Boys stood tall and cold like a fortress. Its gray stone buildings and barbed wire fence reminded Ben more of a prison than a place of learning. His father had been talking the entire drive up from Nairobi. Something about discipline, tradition, and how this school had made him the man he was today. Ben had barely listened. His stomach had been in knots since morning. "Don't slouch, keep your shoulders square," his father barked suddenly, interrupting Ben's thoughts. Ben straightened without thinking. They reached the registration table. A teacher in a brown sweater and a whistle hanging from his neck took Ben's name and pointed them toward Dorm 2B. As they walked through the hallway, Ben could already hear the shouting. Boys yelling, laughing too loudly, teasing. A metal bucket clanged somewhere in the distance. The dorm was narrow, rows of double-decker beds pressed tightly together. A few boys had already claimed their spaces. Some were making their beds, others sitting on top bunks, legs dangling like puppets. Ben found an empty bed at the far end near the window. He bent down to unlock his box. "You'll be fine," his father said, looking around, not unkindly, but with that same steel in his voice. "You just need to learn to stand your ground. Don't be soft." Ben nodded again. He always nodded. When his father finally left, Ben sat on his bed alone. It was only then that he noticed two Form 4s staring at him from across the room. One of them smirked. "New meat," he said to the other. They didn't approach him, yet. But Ben could feel it begin. Night fell quickly. The dorm turned into a jungle of shadows and whispers. Ben wrapped himself in his blanket, eyes wide open, listening to the breathing, the rustling, and the silence between them. In the quiet dorm, fear had a sound, and Ben was starting to hear it clearly. By the third day, Ben had learned that the real rules of St. August weren't written on any notice board. He had learned not to walk on the center aisle of the dorm. Only Form 4s did that. He had learned to wake up at 4:30 a.m., not when the bell rang, but when Brian, the dorm captain, flicked his torchlight across the ceiling twice. That was the unspoken alarm for Form 1s. He had learned that toothpaste, socks, and bread were a currency. If he left them out in the open, they'd disappear. If he asked who took them, he'd be punished for talking too much. Ben's first punishment came on a Thursday evening. He'd returned late from the dining hall after being sent back to fetch his spoon, which he'd forgotten. By the time he got back to the dorm, his locker had been turned upside down, books scattered, clothes flung across the floor. Brian stood by Ben's bed, arms crossed. His voice was calm, but carried weight. "You left your locker open. That's disrespectful to the dorm." Ben opened his mouth to explain, but the look on Brian's face stopped him. "Push-ups, 40. Then hold a bucket of water over your head for 5 minutes. Shirt off." The other boys watched silently. Some Form 1s looked away. Others, already broken in, stared through him. Ben obeyed. His arms trembled by the end, his white shirt soaking in the dust by his feet. As night approached, the dorm filled with noise. Whispers, laughter, insults muttered through mosquito nets. Ben lay stiff on his bed, staring up at the slats above. He thought about home, about how his mother used to wake him with soft humming, about how his father never let him cry during football matches, even when he'd hurt his ankle. "Pain is part of life," his father had said once. "You must learn to carry it like a man." Ben wasn't sure how men carried it. Right now, the weight felt like a stone on his chest, and there was no one he could tell. Not without sounding weak, not without making it worse. Sunday afternoon was the only time boys at St. August were allowed to write home. For many, it was a lifeline, an hour to pour their hearts out or carefully hide the truth. Ben sat on a concrete bench under the mango tree behind the dining hall, a piece of paper resting on his knees. A biro pen dangled in his fingers, tapping lightly. Around him, other Form 1s scribbled quickly, some smiling as they wrote, others chewing their pen caps and frowning. He had started the letter 4 times already. "Dear Mum and Dad, I hope you are well. I am fine." He scratched it out again. He thought about writing the truth, about Brian, about how Dan, the other senior in his dorm, had taken his blanket the night before and warned him not to ask for it back. About how his back still ached from being slapped with a slipper because he forgot to polish someone's shoes. But how would he write that to his father? How would he tell the man who once said, "Real boys don't complain," that every night he wanted to cry into his pillow? He tried again. "Dear Mum, school is okay. I'm still getting used to it. The food is not too bad. I miss home sometimes." It sounded light, harmless, fake, but it would do. When letters were done, they handed them to Mr. Barassa, the English teacher, who always read them first to make sure no one was lying about the school. Ben walked back slowly to the dorm, feeling emptier than when he started. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the school chapel, Ben sat on his metal bed frame, still without a mattress. One of the Form 1s whispered to him, "You'll get used to it." Ben looked at the boy, unsure whether to believe him. Maybe getting used to it was the worst part. Maybe that was the real test of this school. Not exams, not discipline, but silence. A silence so loud it swallowed your voice, and slowly yourself. The rains came without warning. It started with a soft pattering on the dorm's tin roof, then turned violent, wind slapping against the windows, thunder cracking overhead. Boys hurried to pull clothes off the lines strung across beds. A few cheered, excited for the change in weather. But for Ben, rain meant only one thing. The seniors would be in a mood. When the lights flickered and went out, the dorm exploded in noise. "Everyone quiet!" Brian shouted from the far end. The Form 4s gathered near his bed like hyenas circling firelight. Ben curled into his sheet, hoping to disappear, but it was no use. "Ben, come here!" He froze. The other Form 1s glanced his way but said nothing. A few quickly rolled over and faced the wall. Ben walked slowly to the front, heart thudding. Brian sat on his bed, legs crossed, tapping a plastic bucket. "You left your jerry can by the tap this morning. You think this place is your father's compound?" "I'm sorry," Ben whispered. Brian nodded. "Take the bucket, fill it, and bring it back." "In the rain?" Brian smiled. "Did I stutter?" Ben swallowed hard. He took the bucket and stepped outside. Rain sliced through the darkness like cold knives. He reached the tap near the bathrooms, fingers shaking as he filled the bucket. By the time he returned, his clothes clung to his skin. "Now kneel. Hold it above your head," Brian ordered. Ben obeyed. Water sloshed, dripping down his arms, mixing with rainwater still streaming from his hair. The other seniors watched, amused. One of them mimicked Ben's trembling arms. Another took a picture with his phone, giggling. No one stopped it. No one ever did. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Ben couldn't tell. When Brian finally waved him off, Ben stumbled back to his bed, arms numb, teeth chattering. That night, as he lay soaked and shaking on the bare mesh, he whispered into his blanket, "Please, I want to go home." But he didn't even believe it anymore, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew nobody would listen. 2 weeks later, the gates of St. August were flung open for visiting day. Parents streamed in with bags of food, flasks of hot tea, fruits, biscuits, and soft hugs that made even the toughest boys look like little children again. The compound buzzed with warmth and color, like a small village festival. Boys who had barely smiled all term now beamed as they pointed out their parents to friends. Ben stood near the corner of the rugby pitch, eyes scanning the crowd. He spotted them. His mother first, walking briskly in her blue kitten-gay dress, carrying a polythene bag in each hand. His father walked beside her in a checked shirt, hands in his pockets, always looking like he had more important things to do. Ben ran up to them, managing a tired smile. "Ben!" his mother exclaimed, wrapping him in a tight hug. "You've grown thinner." "I'm fine, Mum," he muttered, hugging her back longer than usual. They sat under a tree near the admin block, unpacking chapatis, chicken stew, and boiled eggs. As they ate, Ben spoke carefully. He knew what he could say and what would only bring that familiar disappointment. "How is school?" his father asked between bites. "It's okay." "Okay?" His father raised an eyebrow. "That's not an answer. You need to toughen up. This school makes leaders. The discomfort is part of the training." Ben chewed slowly. He hadn't said anything about the punishments. Not yet. But when his father stood to take a call, Ben leaned toward his mother. "Mum," he said quietly, "some of the older boys, they're not nice. They hit us. They take our things. Last week His mother looked at him, her expression softening, but then she shook her head. "Oh, Ben, don't let that discourage you. You're just homesick. This happens to all Form 1s. You'll get used to it." Ben nodded, a lump rising in his throat. He didn't try again. When visiting hours ended, he watched his parents walk away, his father not even turning around. That night, he lay in the dark, the taste of chicken stew long gone from his tongue. What lingered was something bitter, loneliness mixed with silence. The first time Ben noticed Muli, it was during evening prep. The boy sat 3 desks ahead of him in the Form 1 block, always quiet, always scribbling something in a tiny notebook. Muli was smaller than most boys in their stream. His uniform hung loosely on him, and his shoes were worn at the toes. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but there was a calmness about him that intrigued Ben. One evening after lights out, Ben returned to the dorm after finishing toilet duty, an extra punishment for failing to recite the dorm anthem. As he tiptoed back to his bed, he noticed Muli sitting upright on his lower bunk, facing the wall. "You okay?" Ben whispered. Muli didn't look at him. "Yeah." "You're not sleeping?" Muli shrugged. "Too noisy." There was silence between them for a moment. Then Muli added, "You're Ben, right? The one who had to carry the bucket?" Ben flushed with embarrassment. "Yeah. They did that to me too," Muli said, finally turning to face him. His eyes were calm but tired. "Last term." Ben moved closer. "Why don't you tell anyone?" Muli let out a soft laugh. "Who? The teachers who don't want to hear? Your parents who think it's just discipline?" Ben nodded slowly. "They break you here," Muli whispered. "But you learn when to disappear, when to hide, when to obey fast enough not to be noticed." "You sound like you've been through it." "I have, but I won't let them take the one thing I still have." "What's that?" Muli reached under his pillow and pulled out his notebook. "This." Ben squinted in the dark, but he could make out tiny sketches, boys in dorms, shadows with angry faces, raindrops, hands gripping buckets. "I draw everything," Muli said, "because if I don't, it's like it never happened." Ben stared at him. For the first time since arriving, he felt less alone. He didn't know it yet, but Muli would become the closest thing to a friend he had at St. August. Someone who saw the silence too, and refused to let it bury him. Over the next week, Ben and Muli found quiet ways to talk. They never sat together in class, too suspicious. But in the shadows of evening laundry, or while sweeping the corridor at dawn, they shared small things, memories of home, jokes from childhood, and the names they had for each of the Form 4s in their dorm. They called Brian the Warden. Dan was the Shadow. The rest were nameless, just threats with faces. One Thursday night, the silence broke in a way Ben would never forget. A Form 1 boy named Moses, small, nervous, always sniffing, had been caught using a senior's soap. A crime. A line had been crossed. The punishment came after prep. Brian lined up all the Form 1s in the dorm. Dan stood behind him, arms folded. "Who gave Moses permission to touch my things?" Brian asked. Silence. Moses shook with fear. "I'm sorry. My soap finished and—" A slap cracked through the dorm. Moses fell sideways, clutching his face. "No one touches my things," Brian said, "not even by accident." Then, slowly, he turned to the line of boys. "Since none of you could teach him the rules, you'll all pay for it." They were made to kneel. 10 push-ups, then 15. Then frog jumps across the dorm's length and back. Ben's arms screamed. His knees scraped against the cold cement. Muli beside him winced with every motion, but said nothing. The Form 4s laughed as they paced between them. When the punishment ended, boys crawled back to their beds, some sobbing quietly into their sheets. Brian turned off the lights like a king satisfied with order. Ben couldn't sleep. He stared into the dark, heart still thumping. He thought about Moses, how his lip bled, how his eyes looked empty when he stood again, like part of him had gone somewhere else. Later that night, Ben leaned toward Muli's bed. "This isn't just bullying," he whispered. "It's something else." Muli opened one eye. "I know, but nobody's coming to stop it." The dorm was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that held screams beneath it, and the walls, they had heard everything. Something shifted after Moses. The younger boys started moving differently, faster, more careful, like mice navigating a trap. No one lingered near the dorm captain's bed. Laughter, once rare and fleeting, now disappeared altogether. Even break time was quieter. St. August hadn't broken the boys physically, not yet, but it had taught them how to disappear. But not Ben. Not anymore. The more he talked to Muli, the more he felt the silence tighten around his throat. And somewhere inside, something started to push back. On a Tuesday morning, it snapped. Ben had been called into the staff room. His chemistry teacher wanted to talk about his notes. When he returned to the dorm at lunch, his box was open, his small carton of milk gone, his biscuits half-eaten, crumbled into the floor. Dan sat on Ben's bed, licking the last of the crumbs from his thumb. Ben stared at him. "That's mine." Dan smiled without looking up. "Was." Ben felt the heat rise in his chest. "Why do you always take our things?" Dan laughed. "Did you just grow a backbone?" Ben's fists clenched. "You can't keep doing this. One day someone's going to report you." Dan stood. "You want to report me? Go ahead." Ben didn't move. Dan stepped closer. "Say it again. Go on." "I will," Ben said, voice cracking but steady. Dan slapped him hard, once, across the cheek. It rang in his ears. He stumbled back but didn't fall. Muli burst into the room seconds later, saw Ben holding his face, and froze. Ben didn't cry. He didn't run. He stood still, heart pounding. "I'm not scared of you anymore," he said quietly. Dan scoffed. "Then you're stupid." Later, as Ben sat on the edge of his bed, Muli brought him a wet cloth for his cheek. "You shouldn't have done that," Muli whispered. "I know," Ben replied, "but I had to." He didn't feel brave, but he felt alive. For the first time he had pushed back. He didn't win. He didn't change anything. But for the first time, the silence cracked. By the next morning, the bruise on Ben's cheek had turned deep purple. A few teachers noticed it during class but said nothing. One even asked if he'd fallen during sports. He didn't bother answering. Word of Ben's defiance had spread. Some Form 1s nodded at him in passing, silent recognition. Others kept their distance, afraid. The Form 4s said nothing, but their stares followed him like hawks circling a wounded animal. In the evening, Muli pulled Ben aside behind the dining hall. "There's a way," he whispered. Ben looked up. A way to what? To tell someone, properly, without it being intercepted. Muli explained that every Wednesday, the headmaster walked alone from his office to the chapel for evening prayers. On that path, if someone was brave enough, they could stop him, speak without middlemen, without filters. Ben stared at the ground. What if he doesn't believe me? Then we go back to surviving, Muli said, but at least you'll have tried. The next day, Ben skipped evening prep. His palms were sweaty. He stood by the jacaranda tree beside the chapel path, watching. The school bell rang in the distance. A few birds called out in the fading light. Then he saw him, Mr. Otieno, the headmaster, walking slowly with a prayer book in hand. Ben stepped forward. "Sir?" The headmaster stopped. He looked surprised. "Yes?" Ben opened his mouth. For a moment, nothing came out. Then it spilled, fast, trembling, but clear. The beatings, the punishments, the food theft, the fear, the silence. Mr. Otieno didn't interrupt. When Ben finished, there was only the rustling of trees. The headmaster nodded once. "Go back to class. I'll handle it." Ben walked away, unsure what "handle it" meant. Unsure if he'd just made things worse. But something felt lighter. That night, a teacher came to Dorm 2B. He asked for Brian and Dan, told them to pack their things, said the headmaster had received a very serious complaint. As the two seniors were led out in silence, Ben sat on his bed, Muli beside him. Neither of them smiled, but for the first time, the dorm felt quieter in a good way. A week after Brian and Dan were expelled, things in Dorm 2B shifted. The air wasn't warm, but it was lighter. The younger boys no longer flinched at every footstep. No more punishments after lights out. No more stolen bread. A few boys even laughed again, quietly, nervously, as if remembering what laughter felt like. Ben hadn't told anyone what he'd done, but somehow everyone knew. And that Sunday, his parents returned for the second visiting day of the term. This time, they brought less food. His father carried a newspaper under his arm. His mother brought sliced mangoes in a clear container. They sat beneath the same tree. Ben's cheek had healed, but something else hadn't. "So," his father said, "we heard something strange." Ben looked up. "I received a call from the headmaster," his father continued, voice quieter than usual. "He said you raised a complaint about abuse. Is this true?" Ben didn't speak right away. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes, it's true." His mother gasped softly. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I tried," Ben said. His voice was calm, not angry, but each word carried weight. "That first visit, I tried. You both told me I was just soft, homesick." His father opened his mouth, then closed it. A long silence stretched between them. His mother reached out and touched his hand. "Ben, I'm so sorry. We thought we were helping you grow stronger." "You were," Ben said. "But you didn't want to hear the kind of strong I needed to be." His father finally spoke, his voice lower than Ben had ever heard it. "I failed you. I thought silence was strength. But now, I see that speaking up, that's braver than I ever taught you to be." Ben nodded, eyes burning. This visit, they didn't talk about school rankings or discipline or how to be a man. They talked about safety, about honesty, about healing. And when they hugged goodbye, it wasn't quick. It lingered. Ben turned to walk back to the dorm, heart full but lighter. He didn't know it yet, but this would become the beginning of his story, not the end. The term came to an end quietly. There were no assemblies praising prefects, no announcements about Form 4s being role models. Instead, there were whispered changes, new dorm rules, closer supervision, and a poster suddenly pinned to the notice board. If you see something, say something. Your voice matters. Ben packed his things slowly that last day. Muli sat cross-legged on his bed, notebook open, sketching a small drawing of two boys standing under a jacaranda tree. "You still gonna keep drawing?" Ben asked. Muli nodded. Now more than ever. They smiled at each other, just slightly. When Ben's parents arrived, his mother hugged him like he might vanish. His father helped carry the metal box, holding it like something precious, not just heavy. As they drove home, the silence in the car wasn't cold like it used to be. It was gentle, listening. Halfway through the ride, his father said, "I used to think being a man meant being quiet through pain." He glanced at Ben in the rearview mirror. "But you taught me that real courage is speaking up, even when no one listens." Ben looked out the window, the school shrinking in the distance. "Sometimes silence protects the wrong people," he said quietly. His mother reached back and took his hand. "I promise, next time you speak, we'll hear you." When they got home, Ben slept in his old bed. The mattress felt like a cloud. No shouts, no cold showers, no bucket punishments, just stillness and peace. That night, as he drifted to sleep, he realized something. He had survived. But more than that, he had changed something. Not just for himself, for every boy who would come after him. Listen when children speak, especially when it's hard to hear. Pain doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through a quiet dorm, through a hesitant letter or a bruised cheek. The world teaches boys to man up, but strength isn't silence. Strength is honesty, and healing begins when someone listens. Always, always listen. Stories connect us to our past, shape our present, and guide our future. African Legends and Stories is more than just storytelling. It is a bridge between yesterday and tomorrow, between tradition and modernity. Subscribe now and be part of this journey. Like, comment, and share to keep these legends alive. This is African Legends and Stories, where the past speaks and the future listens.